The French Republic had one of the largest tank industries in Europe and the world during the interwar era, manufacturing a variety of armored vehicles designed for a range of purposes. One of these was the Somua S35 cavalry tank, produced for the French cavalry from 1936 onward. The S-35 was a three-man cavalry tank using cast construction with a fairly thick 40 mm of maximum armor and a 47 mm SA-35 anti-tank gun. Its evolution and successor, the S-40, was about to enter production by the fall of France. It improved upon the vehicle's suspension and turret, and in the future was to receive a more powerful engine. After the fall of France, taking this S-40 as a base, French engineers would secretly design a new cavalry tank, the SARL 42. Hello and welcome to another Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host, Tony, and today I will be covering the SARL 42, a very interesting tank designed by French engineers in secret during the occupation of their country. If you like our videos and want to support us, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to improve future Tank Encyclopedia content. Any help would be greatly appreciated. The German invasion during spring 1940 cut the production of the Somua tank short, weeks before the first S-40 would have left the factories. The installation of the Vichy regime from late June 1940 onward, as well as the armistice of Compiègne and the drastic limitations installed upon the French military and its industrial complex would, in appearance, almost entirely stop France's tank manufacturing efforts. Only some limited official studies, sponsored by the Axis, would remain in existence, for example, projects of improved S-40 tanks with 2 or 3-man turrets destined for Axis export, which were in the works at FCM. As with interwar Germany, though, French military men and engineers were not all keen to respect the humiliating armistice. A secret service within the Vichy army, the CDM, Camouflage du Matériel, or Equipment Camouflage, quickly arose. And while its main task was stockpiling weapons to allow the Vichy army to take up arms again if needed, it also led some armor development projects to at least keep French military engineers busy and at least somewhat up to date. A variety of engineers formed the rather obscure bureau which worked on what would be the new version of France's late 1940s cavalry tank. It is known to have included engineers from both the state bureaus of AMX, Atelier de Construction Mécanique du Sille-Moulineaux, and ARL, Arsenal de Royal, as well as from Somua, which was quite obviously involved, as the tank would be a development of its own work. The most important and well-known engineer involved was ARL's Lavirotte, leader of the project and previous leading figure of the B-1's evolutions, the B-1 bis and the B-1 ter, as well as the short-lived B-40 project. The engineers working on the project no longer had their status as employees of ARL or AMX, being as civilian as one may be in theory. The project was undertaken without the knowledge of not only the German Armistice Commission tasked with ensuring the compliance with the terms agreed at Compiègne, but also from the higher-ups of the Vichy regime and the military. Indeed, the idea behind the shadow tank would be to use it in one way or another as a way to resist German invaders in the future, not as a way to bolster the Vichy regime in its limited operations against the Allies. In order to design the new cavalry tanks, lessons were taken from the Battle of France and the drawbacks faced by French tanks during the campaign. The Somua S35 is generally considered to be one of the French tanks which fared the best, but it still had many issues such as one-man turret and poor cross-country capacities. The S40 improved upon the suspension, but not the one-man turret. The most important change the tank would have to undergo would be a much larger turret, able to accommodate both a 75mm gun, which could adequately target both armor and infantry, as well as a crew large enough to operate the vehicle in decent conditions. This improved cavalry tanks was given the designation of SARL-42. SARL stood for Somua Arsenal de Rueil. The Somua and ARL Bureau, the most heavily involved company in the project, while 42 refers to 1942 when the project, which appeared to have started in the late summer of 1940, reached maturity, at least in terms of design. The vehicle was designed in high secrecy, with everyone having to be ready to hide all plans and work very swiftly in order to avoid detection. The hull was the element of the SARL-42 which would require the least major changes, though that is partially by virtue of the tank's turret being entirely new. The hull was based on the S-40. Several potential lengths were studied before 5.42 meter, as on the S-40, was settled on. The suspension was similar to the S-40 with 10 road wheels, and was generally similar to those found on the Škoda LTVZ-35 or Panzer 35T, due to Somua engineers having worked with Škoda in the interwar years. Significantly enough though, the SARL-42 was to use a welded hull design instead of the previous casting. Fairly forward in the hull was a turret ring. This was a larger turret ring than on previous Somua tanks, as wide as 1730mm, in order to accommodate a much larger turret. With a width of 2.28 meter, the vehicle was somewhat widened from the S-35 and S-40's 2.12 meters in order to accommodate this turret ring. As for the height of the hull, it was 1.71 meter. As for armor layout, the hull front would be 40mm thick, the sides 20mm, and the rear 30mm. The engine compartment was 1.88 meters long. The engine which was to be fitted in the SARL-42 was the same which was planned to be fitted on the later series of the S-40, being a 220 to 230 horsepower 8 cylinders engine. The main point which would make the SARL-42 differ from previous Somua tanks more so than the welded hull was to be its turret and main armament. From the start, it was decided to arm the projected vehicle with a turreted 75mm gun, which would be a considerable increase in firepower in comparison to the 47mm SA-35 main gun. It would, however, also make the presence of more crewmen in the turret, preferably 3, in comparison to just 1 in the previous turrets. Though it was widened in comparison to the S-40, the SARL-42 remained a fairly narrow vehicle, and being planned to be fairly light as well, the turret it was designed to mount out to be relatively limited in size and in weight, despite the will to give it a 3-man crew and 75mm gun. No French tank that was produced or even reached prototype stage prior to 1940 had had a 3-man turret, but that does not mean no work had been done on the matter. In the late 1930s, the French engineers had worked on 3-man 75mm armed turrets for various tanks on the G1 program. ARL had designed the ARL-3 turret for this task, which would serve as a base for work on the SARL-42 turret, but the G1 was to be a heavier and wider tank, and as such, major structural changes still had to be undertaken to make the SARL-42's turret design. The result of the design team's work was a fairly peculiar turret. The SARL-42 indeed had a 3-man turret, but it used some original design elements to make it work. The turret was at its highest in the center and at the rear. This was due to the presence of a telemeter. 2 crewmen sat to the sides of the gun, the loader to the right and the gunner to the left. Due to the turret being lower on the sides as a way to save weight and space mostly, they were not actually positioned entirely within it, and only their busts would reach out into the turret while their legs would be in the tank's hull. The gunner would operate both the gun sight and telemeter, while the loader would also assume the role of a radio operator, with a radio set being located in the turret. As for the commander, he sat in the form of a bustle at the turret's rear and had a commander's cupola. At its highest, on top of this cupola, the tank was 2.84 meter high, about 22 centimeters more than on the S35 and S40. The turret in itself was 1.125 meter high. It appears that there were plans to install a machine gun's mounts or for either one or two anti-aircraft machine guns, very likely 7.5mm MAC-31s, on top of the turret. The tank's turret was planned to feature both an electrical motor and be able to be hand-cranked, as most turrets of the era. The most distinctive element of the turret was its large 1-meter telemeter destined for use by the gunner. The commander apparently could also operate it, as well as use internal binoculars. The armor layout retained for the turret was of 30mm on all sides, lighter than the 40mm of the S35 and S40. The roof would perhaps have the same thickness as the other sides, at least on parts. The inclined roof being higher at the rear would make it a lot more vulnerable than most other roofs found on typical armored vehicles. The main armament of the SARL-42 was a 75mm gun. As with many elements of the tank, it was at least partially newly designed, but based on previous work. Designing the gun was a task of another design bureau. They based their design on the 75mm MLE 1933 fortification gun, itself based on the 75mm MLE 1897. The barrel would be 2.39 meters L32 long, somewhat shorter than on the original gun. This resulted in a slight reduction of the muzzle velocity, though at 570 meters per second, this was only by a mere 15 meters per second. The recoil, however, was quite moderate, which made the use of the gun in the SARL-42 a non-issue. Shells fired included the 1897 or 1940 obus de rupture armor-piercing capped shell APC and the 1915 obus explosive high-explosive HE shell. The exact performance of the gun do not appear to be known. They would likely have been fairly similar to, for example, the M4 Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, though the quantity of 75mm ammunition stowage on the SARL-42 is unknown. We know a small emergency rack was located on the right of the turret, while the vast majority of shells would be carried within the hull. Magazines for the tank's coaxial MAC-31 machine gun were also located on the right of the turret. The 75mm mount was protected by a rather large curved mantlet. With the 75mm L32 gun, but without its basket, the turret was to weigh in at 3,200 kilograms. The tank would overall be around 22 tons. Later during the project's life, a more powerful 75mm gun was designed for use in the SARL-42. It was based on the ballistic profile of the Schneider Model 1932 AA gun, with a breech design based on the Fortification Model 1933 75mm gun. This L-44 gun fired the same ammunition as the L-32, however, it did so at a higher velocity, 715 meters per second for the APC and 700 meters per second for the HE shell. It is known that, fired from this gun, the 1928-1940 APC shell would penetrate 80mm at 1000 meters. In general, in comparison to the L-32, which would be in the same ballpark as the Sherman's M3, the L-44 would be approximately similar to the 75mm L-43 to L-48 guns found on Stuke 304s and Panzer IVs of the mid to late war. The SARL-42 was designed, but how to produce such a tank in the conditions of Vichy France was another question. Several plans were considered. Producing the vehicle in mainland France without attracting German attention was pretty much impossible and out of the question. Production in North Africa was considered, but the industrial base there was insufficient and would require significant efforts to prop up. Two serious options remained. One was to transmit the plans abroad and have the vehicle manufactured in a foreign country which would become an ally if France was to oppose Germany, in other words very likely the USA. What the engineers working on the SARL-42 likely didn't know was by this point, American engineers had designed the Sherman, which would outclass their design and make it redundant. The other plan was to resume French tank production with the SARL-42 once the occupation was over, in order to prop the French armor industry back up and potentially continue the war against Germany. Though this plan will not materialize, work that had been performed on the SARL-42 would still be useful after the war. Work on the SARL-42 was terminated in November of 1942, when German forces occupied the unoccupied part of Vichy France. Even being very optimistic, the design would only be allowed to reach production by 1943 or 1944, by which point it would prove obsolete, with a very limited armor protection, average mobility, and a firepower just decent had the L-44 gun had been fitted. The project could not realistically compete with later versions of the Sherman T-34 or Panzer IVs. France was liberated during the summer of 1944, and as the French industry rose back on its feet, the 75mm gun designed for the SARL-42 would be used in a variety of other designs. The L-32 gun would be featured in a project for a 75mm armed Panhard 178 armored car, and maybe even in the CA-11 light tank prototype, a vehicle we have a video on. The L-44, designated 75mm SA-44, was mounted in the first ARL-44 produced. In the ACL-1 turret, no SARL-42 would ever be made though. Nonetheless, the design remains particularly interesting. It was a serious tank project designed by many professional engineers under very hard conditions, having to hide their work not only from an armistice commission of the victorious Germans, but also their own army's higher-ups. And despite never ever being made, the SARL-42 would remain useful for the French tank industry to rise back up after the war thanks to the gun designed for the project. Though it remained obscure for decades, the inclusion of the tank in wargaming's popular game World of Tanks helped the SARL-42 gain some fame, though many ignore its very interesting and unique background. And that's it for this video treating the SARL-42. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscription. You can find more information relating to the secret tank project in the full article, which is linked in the description. If you like what we are doing and want to let us continue working on these videos, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be allocated to improving our articles and videos for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.